Now these are some of the routes that you'll see that were taken on the Underground Railroad. And you'll see Burlington here, Proctorville and Guyandotte. Here's Greenup County, Kentucky, and Franklin Furnace coming down to Ironton. Now Burlington was actually a hub on the Underground Railroad, at least the local Underground Railroad. Being right on the border, you just sneak right across. And people brought them down from Proctorville down to Burlington, and then on out back here to Poke Patch. From Franklin Furnace and that area, they were brought down to Greenup, and then up to Olive Furnace, and then out up to Poke Patch. So you can see actually the way they would have traveled here. Now this is the old courthouse in Burlington, long gone now, from around 1900. But if any of you are familiar with the Commons Park up in the S-curve, in back of the S-curve, there's a large basketball court sitting there now, exactly where this courthouse sat a little over 100 years ago. This would have been where all of the trials would have been held, where people would have been found to, where it would have been found out whether they were slaves or deemed to be free men. If they were free men, then they actually carried around manumission papers, in which any white person, not just a person of, not just a law enforcement official or anything like that, but any white person could stop them and ask them to see what they were called freedom papers, and it would outline in there that they were actually a free individual. The only problem with that is if you were looking at someone who wasn't exactly honest, they could destroy the papers. And then what evidence do you have that you're actually supposed to be free? You have none. Now there were several Underground Railroad conductors who actually lived in Burlington. And this is the park here, and the S-curve goes right here, Old 52, up around through here. And there was one here that was named Dr. Camillus Hall, Gabe Johnson here, the Nixon family here, Gamaliel Beeman lived here. The Presbyterian church that sat beside where the stone jail is now. The stone jail still sits there in Burlington. And Ralph Leet, who lived up here, who incidentally was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. Now, about the Underground Railroad conductors themselves, they had more than a desire just to right a wrong. They actually had conviction. Think about it yourself. How many of you would actually be willing to risk everything that you own, your freedom, your lives, the lives of your family, all for someone that you had never met, and after you helped them, you would never see again? Conductors were rich, they were poor, they were black, they were white, and they were biracial, which is also known in the historical terms as mulatto. This conviction that these people had was evident in their faith, and the more I'm finding out and researching, the more I'm finding that Methodists, Presbyterians, Quakers, all of them were heavily represented on the Underground Railroad. Also come to find out, Native Americans were as well. But they were watched by their neighbors, they were threatened by their authorities with midnight raids, they were betrayed by their friends, and once word came that the runaways were on the way, the whole countryside turned out, not only to stop the fugitives, but to claim the reward. So all you have to do is point to this person or where they went or what have you, and now you are eligible to receive a reward for taking these people back to slavery. Now the success of the fugitives was absolutely dependent upon a few conscientious men north of the line, Mason-Dixon line, who received no compensation. In fact, made themselves poor serving the helpless fugitives who came to their doors. They may hand them food, which is not like today. You can't go to Walmart and restock your shelves. It comes from what you grew. So if you're giving out food, then you may run short a little bit later. You may give them a $5 gold piece or something along that line, which you're never going to get back. So you were actually giving away stuff. So it cost you to be an Underground Railroad conductor. It could possibly cost you your lives and your freedom. Now, as far as the people that were on the run, freedom seekers. The early fall was actually one of the best times for them to run. The weather was not too hot or it was too cold. You're very seldom going to have shelter. It could be out for months on end, or at least days on end, without any assistance at all. Also, you have to think of what you're going to do to eat. You're not going to be able to go from place to place and ask people for food, because they're possibly going to turn you in and claim that reward I was talking about earlier. So with the fall, you have crops that come into season. And the farther north you move, the crops come in a little later. So they commonly hid in cornfields. Not only does it give you a good place to hide, because as you can see there, you can't see what's in there. So it's a good place to hide, but also you have a lot of food to eat, so you can sit there and stock up and eat a lot of corn, which is full of sugar, and you get a lot of energy that way. Now they were also usually very strong physically, and were people of character, and they were resourceful when they were in any kind of trouble. Some of the things they would do to be able to find north, because you have to understand, blacks at that time, it was illegal to educate them in any way. The education that you're all enjoying today, or maybe regretting that you have to take part in, they longed for that. It was illegal to teach them to read or write. But what they would do is, in these Negro spirituals that I was referring to earlier, they talked about following the drinking gourd, which is the Big Dipper, and they would follow the North Star because it always led them north to freedom. Or they would also follow the moss that grew on trees, because it always grows on the north side. Now there were a couple here that, and I'm just going to kind of brush over these real quick. Reverend William Stewart, who was a black man from out in Macedonia. And from 1840 to 1860, he preached at the colored settlement at Burlington and Macedonia. And he led a large number of freedom seekers over the hills and through the dense woods to Pope Patch. He had a brother named John Stewart, who also taught out at Macedonia Church out there today, or in that area. And he taught singing and taught day school. And then there was another guy, a Philip Lynch, who also lived in that, worked along there, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and worked at the number 2, which was one of the 3 hotels that sat in Burlington in the park that sits there today. He worked there along with the mother of Gabe Johnson, who was a cook there. So this hotel that sat there in the park has ties to at least 2 Underground Railroad conductors. Now some of you may recognize this building here. It still stands. It's the old jail just as you come out of the S-curve heading towards Chesapeake. This building here is actually a old Presbyterian church. And there was a conductor there by the name of Gamaliel Beeman. And him and his wife, they came to Burlington in 1838. Now Burlington at that time, this church only had was 34 members. 17 of them were slaveholders. But there was a split in the Presbyterian church at that time, and he actually kicked all of them out of the church. They went across the river and started a new church on their own, taking from this place a cornerstone, and used it as a cornerstone for their church in West Virginia. It sits on 5th Avenue today, right down the street from Jim's Spaghetti House, and right next door to Huntington Federal Savings and Loan Bank. Now this is the Burlington jail that some of you may recognize, as I was mentioning before. And you'll see that, as I said, it's right here in this picture. Now how many people recognize this guy? O.J. Mayo? What does he have to do with the Underground Railroad? Well, actually, personally, nothing. But his family. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his family history. Now, right behind where Sam's Club and Little Caesar's Pizza, you'll find this cemetery. It's called the Burlington 37 Cemetery. In this cemetery, there's you'll see this monument, which lists the names of 37 manumitted slaves of James Twyman of Madison County, Virginia. There's a book called The Promised Land, which was written about 20 years ago by J. Earl Pratt, that details as much information in there as is possible. This is the James Twyman Plantation in Madison County. This is where the 37 were, O.J. Mayo's ancestors. This is where they would have served as slaves. Now, James Twyman, he manumitted, as I said, he manumitted 37, Okay, back to here. Okay, James Twyman, he manumitted 37 slaves in 1849. Now, he didn't just free them. He gave them $10,000 to come here in Burlington and buy land, which is the equivalent of a little bit over $2 million today. He also provided other things for their care. He provided horses, ox, wagons, everything. Now 30 of them actually, from what I can tell, 30 of them actually came to Burlington. 3 who were older and were invalids remained in Virginia, and he provided homes for them there that could never be sold as long as they lived. And 3 women remained in Virginia. They were described as his favorites, but they remained there, and one named Washington is unaccounted for. Not sure exactly what happened with Washington, but it's very possible that he learned of his James's impending death and decided to make escape on his own. If so, then it's possible he made it to freedom. It's also very possible, and actually more likely, that he was captured and sold into slavery once again. The 37 actually thought very highly of James Twyman, and in the records that I found, they really thought a lot of the man. So he wasn't the kind of slave owner as I showed you the picture earlier. Now, it's unknown where James Twyman's buried. This is me and my father at the cemetery there at the Twyman Plantation in Virginia. Now, it's a small family cemetery, probably about 10 or 15 tombs or gravestones there. James does not have one. Now, it's rumored he was buried outside of the Twyman family cemetery because he decided to free his slaves. Now, you have to think, 37 slaves worth about $47,000 apiece, and then you gave them the equivalent of $2 million to come here as well. You can possibly understand why some of his family members may not have thought very much of that idea. Probably a little greed came into play, not to mention, why are you giving these people away that I could use? Remember, these people were they were the same as cattle. They were not considered people at all. This is also part of the plantation, looking there from the cemetery. So you can see it's a very beautiful place. Another shot of the plantation there.